one and all. Welcome to this edition of Kitz Corner. Hope you're in a fantastic day so far. I do apologize for my hoarse voice. I'm just coming off of a sore throat, so it's a bit scratchy, but the show must go on. And definitely a show that we'll have to report on this because new revelations are coming out. Thanks to Tucker Carlson for his access to the raw data and footage of the January 6th storming of the Capitol that proves all in perspective that this was a manufactured piece by the establishment to sell you the idea that half the country are violent extremists and so on and so forth. We showed you how at the beginning Tucker Carlson was showing footage inside of how people were respectful. They were mostly taking pictures, how the cops were kind of showing them around. It was very a peaceful demonstration. There was no violent attack. There was no craziness to that. Then we also showed you how the FBI was also involved with it. But then there's also the narrative of the cops, because that was always something that was brought to attention, that officers died at the situation. There was one guy that, was stormed and barricaded, and then these people just came at him and he died on the scene protecting the Capitol. But there was always more to that story. There was always suspicion to the fact that, first off, they knew that there was going to be a major protest at the Capitol, and they were severely understaffed with cops showing up to this rally. There was more cops at a Medicare for All rally than this protest. That's the one suspicion of that. But also there was more to this situation, and there was no evidence revealed in the autopsy. But Tucker Carlson, once again, is going to reveal how, again, the mainstream media manipulate the story to sell you the idea that the Capitol Police, the politicians, were the victims in this, and selling you the fear, selling you the propaganda, when really the proof is in the footage. And here's Tucker Carlson once again showing you the cops that apparently died and how they were still on footage. They were still on camera when they were announced that they were dead, according to politicians. So take a listen to this.
Hours of January 6th, literally hours, you began to hear that day described as a deadly insurrection, and not described by one news outlet or one politician, but in unison by all of them, almost like it was coordinated. A deadly insurrection. That's how history may record January 6th. But the tape that we reviewed from within the building on that day proves it was neither an insurrection nor deadly. Here it is.
January 6th, when an estimated 2,000 rioters breached the Capitol building, causing the deaths of 5 police officers.
Certain dates echo throughout history.
So that was the thing that they always pointed out in the media, and how people said it was such a deadly event, and how these people were murderers and thugs was because there was officers that died on the scene. And we were, again, it was trying to build that sympathy, trying to sell you the idea that they were the victims, and how politicians were the victims, and how AOC was trapped in her office and felt persecuted, and it was just such a horrific event. It was all there to manufacture that narrative, to make them seem like the victims, even though they are the bloodthirsty rogue killers that they claim ordinary people are. And they said that, 5 officers died. There was no proof of evidence to that. Even the, autopsy revealed that there was no proof of evidence that the insurrection, as they call it, caused the events of these people. And you're about to see here how they fooled you to believe that an officer who was just off camera at the time made it sound more horrific than it was. So let me cap that again.
Here it is.
January 6th, when an estimated 2,000 rioters breached the Capitol building, causing the deaths of 5 police officers.
Certain dates echo throughout history. December 7th, 1941. September 11th, 2001. And January 6th.
The mob beat officers with anything they had on them: hockey stick, a flagpole, a fire extinguisher. Police officers died.
Donald Trump supporters who, of course, rioted and killed police officers.
By the evening of January 6th, the Democratic Party and its publicists in the national news media had settled on a description of what had happened that day. They distilled an enormous number of highly complex events that even now we don't fully understand, into a single emotionally laden political slogan, which they've repeated for years with remarkable discipline. January 6th, they said, was a deadly insurrection.
There was a deadly insurrection that the right wing is trying to cover up.
He incited a deadly insurrection.
Incited a deadly insurrection.
The violent, deadly insurrection on the Capitol 9 months ago was about white supremacy, in my view.
A deadly insurrection.
As we just saw raw footage of people walking in with no guns, no ammunition, no violent weapons, and there was also a mix of all different types of people. There was white people, there was brown people, there was black people. Again, the reason this protest existed, not just because of MAGA and Trump and that fusion, but also people were upset over the lack of response to COVID, the lack of response to the pandemic, how people were suffering economically because of the pandemic, because of the lockdowns, and people were fed up of the federal government screwing them time and time and time again, which is one of the reasons we even had Donald Trump in the first place. Not because of Russia, not because of a bunch of memes, not because a bunch of white supremacists just magically appeared in the United States. It's because people are so goddamn upset with the federal government time and time again, that every single administration has screwed them over time and time again, that they rolled the dice with the game show host because they don't want to suckle again with another establishment tool like Hillary Clinton, or now with Joe Biden.
Everything about that phrase is a lie. Very little about January 6th was organized or violent. Surveillance video from inside the Capitol shows mostly peaceful chaos. But the slogan worked. The term deadly carries enormous emotional power, which is why they used it. To prove the insurrection was deadly.
It's so funny that they call this deadly. I've seen worse at a sports riot when, the Philadelphia Eagles won, or the Vancouver Canucks, or even the Toronto Raptors championship in 2019. That, I think, was more deadly than any of this. There's more deadly contact at a sports game. And they consider that, that's how the media plays you. Is that blowing up cars because of a sports game is okay, but having people gather non-violent with no guns, no ammunition, no weaponry is deadly. And because they want to sell you the idea that politicians are the victims. Just unbelievably crazy. Just like how Canada, my homeland right here, sold you the idea that peaceful truckers were also insurrectionists. They're deadly, they're violent, they're misogynists, they're white supremacists, as Justin Trudeau announced on a French television program. And we saw the footage, and it was bouncy castles, there was food given out, and they were dancing in the street. I didn't see any violence. Again, the proof is in the footage.
Propagandists pointed to the death of an officer called Brian Sicknick. The mob killed Officer Brian Sicknick. That's what they said. It was their single most powerful indictment of the January 6th protesters, and of Donald Trump, and of Republican voters nationally. They repeated that claim for years. They are still repeating it. At first, they told the country that Officer Sicknick was murdered with a fire extinguisher.
Officer Brian Sicknick died after being hit in the head with a fire extinguisher during the fight.
That story came from the New York Times, which is effectively the assignment editor for most of the rest of American media. It was a lie, untrue in any way. But only after that lie had hardened into conventional wisdom did the newspaper bother to retract it.
The New York Times has quietly retracted its story about the death of Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick.
The damage had been done. Brian Sicknick, himself a Trump voter, had been transformed without his consent into a political martyr of the left. His memory was shamelessly exploited by the incoming Biden administration. In February of 2021, Sicknick's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, where a parade of unscrupulous politicians made use of it. Here's Joe Biden.
Breaking down the doors, trying to overturn an outcome of election.
and killing several police officers in the meantime.
But Brian Sicknick should not be reduced to a prop for the political ambitions of the Democratic Party. He was a human being. The facts of his life matter, including how he died. To this day, media accounts describe Sicknick as someone who was, quote, slain on January 6th. The video we reviewed proves that is a lie. Here is surveillance footage of Sicknick walking in the Capitol after he was supposedly murdered by the mob outside. By all appearances, Sicknick is healthy and vigorous. He's wearing a helmet, so it's hard to imagine he was killed by a head injury. Whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe that he was killed by a fire extinguisher to the head when he was wearing a helmet, when he's got riot gear on, and the fact that he's walking on by after they announced he's dead and escorting people in. You could see he's riling people up. Get inside. Come on, get inside. He was waving people in. Yeah, it's very fabricated. Again, to sell you the idea that these are violent people, that this is a deadly insurrection, as the mainstream media wants to point out to this, and how it was people trying to overturn the 2020 results of the election, which is, again, another suspicion that you can't talk about the results of the 2020 election, but you could say all you want about the 2016 election. You could say all you want about how that was stolen and Donald Trump is not the illegitimate president, but you can't mention about 2020. You can't mention about the recent one. Which makes me think, can you rehash 2000 election? Because now George Bush is a friend of the Democratic Party. He's a friend of the establishment. Can you say that was a lie? I don't know. I don't know what the context is for the establishment status quo.
What happened to Brian Sicknick was very obviously not the result of violence he suffered at the entrance to the Capitol. This tape overturns the single most powerful and politically useful lie the Democrats have told us about January 6th. And it was indeed a lie. The January 6th committee knew perfectly well that Brian Sicknick was walking normally through the Capitol after he was supposedly murdered by Trump supporters. And they know that because they saw this tape. We can be sure because the footage contains an electronic bookmark that is still archived in the Capitol's computer system. That means that investigators working for the Democratic Party reviewed this tape. They saw it, but they refused to release the tape to the public. Why? Because this tape would shatter the fraud they were perpetrating on the country. Because hiding the truth served their political interest. They lied about the police officer they claimed to revere. If they were willing to do that, then their dishonesty knew no limits.
So there you go. They lied about even the cops being killed. Again, the whole purpose of it is to manufacture this narrative, to direct people to think that this is a violent insurrection, that people died on this day. And there were people that died, the protesters, not cops, but protesters that were beaten down by Capitol Police were killed on that day. None of it got mentioned on mainstream media. None of it. None of it got mentioned. The actual proof and the real people that suffered on that day never got mentioned. But they wanted to victimize cops. They want to victimize politicians. They want to victimize the people that are purposely manipulating you so they can sell you this story, so they can manipulate you even more, so they can stretch out the story as much as possible and exploit it at every point in turn to demonize, to segregate half the population of the United States. The same way that Canada did with the truckers. This is government entities and government bodies using a situation like this and exploiting it for their own personal means to go against the people. This is the establishment playbook 101. And it is just absolutely disgusting that even cops, they even exploited their own police officers. They even exploited them to push this narrative. It shows no bounds. Here's also this too that I want to bring attention to. This also is the lack of officers there, because you heard Tucker Carlson say that this was a massive event and they knew about this. So why exactly was there not enough officers to stop these people from storming into the Capitol? It doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to anybody else. But maybe it was done purposely. And here's proof of it, that maybe that claim, that suspicion, that conspiracy, that this was done purposely in order to, again, entice this even more and make it seem like a violent event, how they orchestrate and put this all together. Take a listen to this.
Many in federal law enforcement knew perfectly well there was going to be a huge demonstration in Washington on the afternoon of January 6, 2021, and that it could become potentially violent. There's no debate about that fact. The FBI knew. But it's also clear that many on the U.S. Capitol Police Force, the frontline officers who protect the Congress, did not know. They had no idea what was coming. And because they didn't know, they were completely unprepared for what happened that day. That is a very strange failure of communication, and it has never been explained. To understand more about the response to January 6th inside the Capitol, we sat down with a man called Tarek Johnson. Johnson served as a Capitol Hill police officer for 22 years. On the day of the protests, he says he was responsible for securing the certification of the presidential election. If there is anyone at the very heart of the January 6th story, it's former Capitol Police Lieutenant Tarek Johnson. And yet, for some reason, the January 6th committee never called him to testify.
My voice was one of the first ones you hear on the audio transmission, so
So there's another suspicion. The fact that the January 6th committee didn't talk to their top cop, didn't talk to the top responder to this insurrection. Why would they not want to get his opinion? Why would they not want to listen to his side of the story? He was the one that was guarding the Capitol. He was the top officer in charge of that situation. Wouldn't they want to get a response from him? Wouldn't they want to hear his side of the story? Maybe because his side of the story isn't in line with the establishment.
I did expect to get an interview at some time, but no, it didn't happen. I guess the focus was on Donald Trump.
According to Johnson, no one answered his numerous pleas for help over Capitol Police radio frequencies. Johnson says he, quote, didn't hear anything on the radio. According to Johnson, Yogananda Pittman kept vital information about the protests from frontline officers like him. Pittman was the assistant chief of the department in charge of intelligence operations.
We should have been better prepared that day, and we could have been better prepared that day if the information was disseminated like it was supposed to be.
So they knew about this situation. He called for backup multiple times. They didn't say a word. They did not say a word. They did not order for more backup. They didn't have any more officers, and they had more officers in their back pocket. It wasn't like all the cops randomly had a day off. They had officers at the ready. But this was purposely done, again, to manufacture this protest to make it seem even more extreme. This is how the media, this is how the establishment likes to fool people. They orchestrate these situations to make it more worse than what it is. And they've done it time and time and time again. And this is just another example, but they want to make this into this is a national scale so that they can demonize half the population and deem them as domestic terrorists, even though they weren't. And you could see the proof is in the footage. The proof is in the raw video of the security cameras that were around the Capitol, showing that people were not violent. They didn't have weaponry. And these people that were walking in the Capitol were very respectful. And the cops actually got selfies with them and escorted them around the building.
Once protesters moved inside the building, Johnson's first concern was the safety of senators. His job was to protect them. In rising panic, he called over the radio for direction and assistance. Even now, 2 years later, he is baffled by the response he got.
I was requesting permission to evacuate the Senate side, the Senate chambers, because I had a clear line of sight to get them out the Senate door, and I didn't get permission. The dispatcher called a couple times to see if I can get permission. No response.
With Yogananda Pittman and his other supervisors.
So he had to ask for permission to get more officers, and he got completely ignored. On a national security threat like this. Again, how do people not get suspicious over this? How was this not, investigated? How was this not part of the January 6th committee that they suspiciously did not have enough officers when there's a national security threat ordered the fact that people were coming to the Capitol building? You'd think this would be a top priority for them.
Supervisors unresponsive. Johnson says he decided to begin the evacuation of senators himself.
The person that I thought was going to authorize the evacuation didn't do it. I wanted to get those members of Congress out as quickly as I could. That's why I initiated, those evacuations. Me being disciplined, it wasn't as important as not getting the members of Congress and their staff to safety.
Footage we reviewed seems to bolster Johnson's account. The video shows Johnson conducting the evacuation of senators from the chamber. Yet Tark Johnson was not rewarded for what he did. He was punished. A photo emerged of Johnson wearing a MAGA hat outside the Capitol. That picture cost him his career.
Sometimes I look at it and thank you, God, for blessing me with this hat. And sometimes I'm like, wow, I wish this hat never came in my life.
A Biden voter, Johnson says he donned the hat in an effort to rescue fellow officers he believed were trapped in the building.
I figured if I had the hat on, it'd be easier for me to navigate my way through the crowd. It was basically self-preservation and de-escalation, and I needed to get up those steps. I couldn't say what would have happened.
Jeez, so a Capitol police officer who was wearing a MAGA hat to disguise himself to save politicians in the Capitol was punished. But FBI informants that were also donning civilian clothes, wearing Trump gear, got praised for starting this event. Do you see the clues? Do you see the obvious signs? How the establishment put this all together? How they orchestrated this whole entire event? And how they've used this event tirelessly to go against people? They've been trying to stretch this for the last 2 years now. Because now we're in 2023. This happened in 2021. And they've tried for 2 years now, trying to stretch this out as much as possible to demonize half the population. To try to make sure Trump will never become president again. It was an effort to demonize the public. To go after people that were already pissed off at the government, pissed off at Congress, pissed off at the administration and the establishment that has played them like fools for years. And the fact that this was a time when the COVID lockdown was happening, people were financially screwed, people were economically screwed, they lost their businesses, they lost their homes, they lost their lifestyles, and they were just getting the short end of the stick. They were getting nothing. They sent $5 trillion to Wall Street, and you didn't barely get a penny in the response to COVID. You lost your livelihood, but Wall Street never did. Congress was still able to have a job. They were still able to get a six-figure salary. You couldn't get income. So building that aggression, plus the 2020 election results, but they exploited this to the next level, purposely to serve their agenda.
And walking through that crowd without it.
But for the crime of wearing a Trump hat, Johnson found himself suspended. Ultimately, he resigned from the force and lost his pension. He now works part-time as a furniture mover. Yogananda Pittman, meanwhile, thrived. 2 days after January 6th, Nancy Pelosi elevated Pittman to acting chief of the Capitol Police. Late last year, Pittman took...
So he got fired. He has to now work a part-time job as a furniture mover. Nancy Pelosi herself gave this lady, who was the top chief, who did not send any more officers, ignored the backup calls, ignored the security threats. They promoted her. Nancy Pelosi personally promoted her. Do you see how this is all orchestrated? Do you see why this is such a big joke? That this is not a threat to democracy? This is not a violent insurrection against the Capitol and democracy in America as a whole. This is not the Pearl Harbor or 9/11 as Anderson Cooper or Rachel Maddow will tell you to believe. This is all an orchestration from the top down. It was a complete orchestration. This was a manufactured event in order to sell you the idea that half the population are domestic terrorists, fearmonger that Trump supporters are the most violent people, and also sell you the idea that Trump is a violent extremist and he'll never become president. In order for people to get in line, stay with the status quo, stay with the establishment that's still continuing to screw you over, still epitomizing you day in and day out. And this is an orchestration with the politicians at the Capitol Police, the FBI, the CIA. They all played a part in this. They all played a part. And the people that should be punished and should be held accountable get promoted. And the people that were helping to save lives and actually do diligence in a situation like this, they get demoted, they get fired off, they get smacked in the face. And these are the same politicians that, will say that we need to respect law enforcement. We need to do everything that we can. They give the most bloated cop budget to Capitol Hill after the insurrection. But they don't investigate why Capitol Police were not ready for a situation like this, even though they were informed on it. And it's because of stuff like this. They don't want you to know. They don't want you to know because then they can't sell you the story. They can't exploit it. They can't stretch out the truth any longer if you know more than they do. And knowledge is the greatest power. Unity and knowledge is the greatest power against the establishment. And that's why they don't want us to be informed. They don't want us to be together. They don't want us to be informed. They want us segregated. They want us divided, yelling at our neighbors, yelling at each other while they get away from crimes. And also keeping us in the dark.